Most people think they know WW2's darkest moments. But what if the worst horrors were deliberately hidden from history books? Tonight you'll discover why some events were too disturbing to teach. The world was still picking up the pieces from the Great War when the seeds of an even deadlier conflict began to sprout. Germany sat in ruins, not just from bombs and bullets, but from something far more crushing: humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end World War I, it practically guaranteed there'd be another one. Picture this. Germany had to pay reparations so massive that economists today still scratch their heads at the sheer audacity. We're talking about 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion in 1921 money. That's like asking someone to pay off the entire GDP of a small country while their own economy was already on life support. The German people were furious, broke, and desperate for someone to blame. Then came 1929. Wall Street crashed, and the economic shockwaves rippled across every continent. Banks collapsed like dominoes, unemployment skyrocketed. Families lost everything they'd worked for. But economic disasters don't just destroy bank accounts. They destroy faith in governments, in democracy, in the whole system. Germany wasn't the only country feeling the squeeze. Over in Japan, military leaders were getting restless. Why struggle with economic problems when you could just take what you needed from your neighbors? In 1931, Japanese forces stormed into Manchuria, claiming they were protecting their interests. Sound familiar? It should. This playbook would get a lot of use over the next decade. Italy's Benito Mussolini was watching and taking notes. By 1935, he decided Africa looked pretty appealing. Ethiopia became his target, and despite the League of Nations wagging their fingers disapprovingly, Italian forces rolled right in. The international community's response? Basically a strongly worded letter that'll show them right. Meanwhile, back in Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler was making some serious political moves. The Nazi Party seemed like a joke in the early 1920s. Their first big political stunt ended with Hitler in prison. But desperate times make people do desperate things. By 1933, this same man who'd been laughed out of beer halls was now running the country. The weird part is how quickly everything spiraled. While one day nations were trying to negotiate and maintain peace, the next they were rebuilding their armies and drawing up invasion plans. The League of Nations, supposed to keep everyone in line, turned out to be about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Each aggressive move made the next one easier to justify. Japan took Manchuria and got away with it. Italy conquered Ethiopia without serious consequences. Germany started rearming and nobody stopped them. It was like watching dominoes line up, each one making the eventual fall more catastrophic. What made this especially dangerous was how these countries started eyeing each other as potential allies rather than threats. Shared enemies have a funny way of bringing strange bedfellows together. The stage was being set for something much bigger than regional conflicts. By the late 1930s, the world had become a powder keg with multiple people holding matches. The question wasn't really whether war would break out, it was where the first spark would land. And that answer would come from an unexpected direction, setting off a chain reaction that would consume the globe. The morning of September 1, 1939, changed everything. German tanks rolled across the Polish border like steel thunder, crushing whatever stood in their way. Polish guards at the frontier posts barely had time to grab their rifles before Wehrmacht soldiers overran their positions. This wasn't just another border skirmish. This was the beginning of the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever seen. Hitler had been planning this moment for months. His generals called it Fall Weiss, Case White. The code name sounded innocent enough, but the reality was brutal. Over 1.5 million German troops poured into Poland from 3 directions simultaneously. The Poles never stood a chance against such overwhelming force. But here's what made this invasion truly terrifying. The Germans introduced the world to something called Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. Forget the slow grinding battles of World War I where armies faced each other across muddy trenches for years. This was war at breakneck speed. German dive bombers screamed down from the sky, targeting bridges, railways and communication lines. Panzer tanks punched through Polish defenses like hot knives through butter. The weird part, most of the world was still fighting the last war in their heads. Polish cavalry units actually charged German tanks with sabers and lances. Brave. Absolutely. Effective. Not even close. These weren't medieval knights facing other horsemen. They were flesh and blood against steel and explosives. Meanwhile, Britain and France sat on their hands for 2 whole days. Politicians argued in London and Paris while Warsaw burned. Finally, on September 3rd, both nations declared war on Germany. Too little, too late for the Poles, who were already fighting for their lives. The bombing of Warsaw became a preview of horrors to come. German Stukas targeted everything: hospitals, schools, residential neighborhoods. The city's population huddled in basements while buildings collapsed around them. Fire trucks couldn't reach burning districts because the streets were filled with rubble and unexploded bombs. Polish resistance was fierce but hopeless. Soldiers fought with outdated equipment against the most modern army in Europe. Their air force was destroyed on the ground within the first 48 hours. Communication lines were cut, supply chains disrupted, and command structures shattered. Then came the knockout punch. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Stalin and Hitler had secretly agreed to carve up Poland between them. Polish forces, already stretched thin against the Germans, now faced enemies on two fronts. Game over, the numbers tell the story. Over 60,000 Polish soldiers died defending their homeland. Hundreds of thousands more were captured or wounded. Entire divisions simply vanished in the chaos. Poland, which had existed as an independent nation for barely 20 years since World War I, disappeared from the map again. The September campaign lasted just 35 days. 35 days to conquer a country of 35 million people. The speed shocked military observers worldwide. If Germany could steamroll Poland this quickly, what about other European nations? What they didn't realize yet was that this lightning-fast conquest was just the opening act. The real devastation would come when German attention turned westward toward France. After crushing Poland in just weeks, Hitler turned his attention west. France sat behind the mighty Maginot Line, a fortress system that stretched along the German border like a concrete wall of doom. French generals felt pretty confident about their fancy fortifications. Too bad Hitler wasn't planning to knock on the front door. The German strategy was brilliantly simple: go around the whole thing. While French troops waited behind their concrete barriers, German tanks rolled through Belgium and Luxembourg in May 1940. It was like expecting a burglar to come through the front door while they're already climbing through your bedroom window. The speed shocked everyone. German panzers moved through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French thought was impossible for tanks. Military experts had called it impassable. Well, someone forgot to tell the Germans that. Within days, German armor was racing across French countryside, leaving bewildered defenders in their dust. French forces found themselves completely outmaneuvered. The blitzkrieg tactics that demolished Poland now turned France into a giant game of catch-up. French tanks were often better than German ones, but they were scattered and used defensively. Meanwhile, German forces concentrated their power like a hammer blow, smashing through weak points, and then spreading chaos behind enemy lines. Then there's the miracle that almost wasn't. At Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied soldiers found themselves trapped on the beaches with their backs to the sea. German forces had them surrounded, but instead of finishing them off immediately, Hitler ordered his tanks to halt. Some say he wanted the Luftwaffe to claim the glory. Others think he hoped Britain might negotiate peace if he showed restraint. Whatever the reason, it gave the Allies precious time. British boats of every size, from naval destroyers to fishing vessels, crossed the English Channel to rescue trapped soldiers. Fishermen and weekend sailors became heroes, ferrying exhausted troops to safety under constant air attack. The evacuation saved an army that would later help liberate Europe. Makes sense that Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, right? Paris fell on June 14, 1940. German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées while Parisians watched in stunned silence. The city that had withstood siege in 1870 surrendered without a fight to preserve its monuments and people. French leaders declared Paris an open city, rather than see it destroyed in urban warfare. The human cost was staggering. Over 90,000 French soldiers died during the 6-week campaign. Millions of civilians fled south in massive refugee columns that clogged roads and spread panic. German dive bombers often targeted these fleeing families, adding terror to an already desperate situation. France was carved up like a dinner roast. Germany occupied the North and Atlantic coast directly. The southern zone became Vichy France, technically independent, but really a German puppet state. Marshal Pétain, the hero of World War I, now collaborated with former enemies, while Charles de Gaulle broadcast resistance calls from London. The fall of France left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, but that isolation would soon test British resolve in ways no one could imagine. After crushing France in mere weeks, Hitler felt unstoppable. But there was one annoying problem standing between him and total European domination. A small island nation that refused to surrender. Britain wasn't going anywhere, and Churchill had made that crystal clear. The German war machine needed to cross the English Channel, but first they had to destroy the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority, any invasion would be suicide. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, boasted he could bring Britain to its knees in just a few weeks. Well, that didn't exactly go according to plan. Starting in July 1940, German bombers began attacking British airfields and radar stations. The RAF had roughly 700 fighter planes. The Germans, over 2,600 aircraft. The math looked terrible for Britain, but the British had something the Germans didn't expect. Radar technology that could spot incoming attacks from miles away. Young RAF pilots, many barely out of their teens, scrambled into their Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day. They were outnumbered 3-1, but they fought like their lives depended on it, because they did. These pilots averaged 6 hours of sleep and flew multiple missions daily. Some didn't make it back for dinner. Then came the Blitz. When daylight bombing failed, Hitler switched tactics in September 1940. If he couldn't destroy the RAF on the ground, he'd terrorize the population instead. German bombers started hitting London every single night for 56 consecutive nights. The sound of air raid sirens became as familiar as morning coffee. Londoners developed a strange routine. When the sirens wailed, they grabbed blankets and headed underground. Tube stations became massive bomb shelters. Families set up makeshift beds on train platforms. Some people practically lived down there, emerging only for work during the day. The bombing was relentless. Entire neighborhoods disappeared overnight. St. Paul's Cathedral stood surrounded by rubble, somehow surviving direct hits. Fires raged across the city, visible from space. But here's the weird part. British morale actually strengthened. Instead of breaking their spirit, the bombing made people angrier and more determined to fight back. Churchill's voice crackled over radio broadcasts, rallying the nation. His speeches became legendary. "We shall never surrender," wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise. Even when Buckingham Palace got bombed, the royal family refused to leave London. RAF pilots became national heroes. They shot down over 1,700 German aircraft during the battle. The cost was brutal though. Britain lost 544 aircrew members, while over 43,000 civilians died in the bombing raids. Children were evacuated from cities in massive operations, sent to live with strangers in the countryside for safety. By October 1940, it was clear the German strategy had failed. The RAF was still flying, British factories kept producing planes, and the population hadn't collapsed into panic. Hitler quietly postponed his invasion plans. The Luftwaffe shifted focus elsewhere, looking for easier targets. Britain had survived, but barely. The island nation proved it could take a beating and keep fighting. This resilience would prove crucial, because across the Atlantic, another sleeping giant was about to get a very rude awakening. After watching Poland crumble in just 1 month, Hitler wasn't about to take a coffee break. The German war machine had tasted victory, and frankly it wanted more, much more. The spring of 1940 would prove that lightning warfare wasn't just a lucky punch, it was a devastating new reality that would reshape Europe in ways nobody saw coming. Denmark fell first, and calling it a battle would be generous. German forces crossed the border on April 9, 1940, and the entire country surrendered in just 6 hours. 6 hours, that's barely enough time to watch a Lord of the Rings movie. The Danish government, realizing they faced impossible odds, chose to save their people from pointless slaughter. Smart move, considering what happened next door. Norway put up a real fight, but geography worked against them. German paratroopers dropped from the sky while warships sailed into their fjords. The Norwegians had brave hearts and fierce determination, but Hitler had something else entirely: speed and surprise. Within 2 months, Norway's resistance collapsed, though some brave souls escaped to Britain to fight another day. Then came the big show. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg all felt the German boot on May 10, 1940. The Dutch thought their water barriers would slow the advance. Wrong. German engineers had studied every canal, every bridge, every possible crossing point. When the Wehrmacht rolled forward, they moved like a river, finding the easiest path downhill. Rotterdam became a symbol of this new kind of warfare. The city centre vanished in 14 minutes of bombing. 14 minutes? An entire urban landscape reduced to smoking rubble faster than most people eat lunch. Over 900 civilians died. and 78,000 lost their homes. The message was crystal clear: surrender fast, or watch your cities burn. But here's where things get really terrifying. These weren't random attacks by desperate armies. Every move was calculated, planned, and executed with machine-like precision. German tanks punched through defensive lines, while Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, creating panic among defenders. Communication lines got cut, supply routes disappeared, and organized resistance crumbled. Millions of civilians packed whatever they could carry and fled toward safety that didn't exist. Roads became rivers of refugees, families pushing carts, carrying children, dragging elderly relatives. The lucky ones had cars, but fuel ran out quickly. Most walked, and many never reached their destinations. The speed shocked everyone, including Germany's own allies. Military experts had predicted these campaigns would take months, maybe years. Instead, entire nations fell in weeks. Traditional warfare suddenly looked as outdated as cavalry charges against machine guns. Well, actually worse than that, because at least cavalry charges were predictable. German forces installed puppet governments faster than they conquered territories. Local officials who cooperated kept their jobs. Those who didn't, they vanished into the growing network of prisons and camps that followed every German advance. By summer 1940, Hitler controlled more European territory than Napoleon ever dreamed of. But conquering was just the beginning, and the real test was yet to come. Someone else was watching these lightning victories very carefully, making plans of their own. While Hitler was busy conquering Western Europe, he had his eyes on a much bigger prize: Russia, the largest country in the world, packed with oil, grain, and millions of people to enslave. Stalin thought his peace treaty with Germany would keep him safe. He was dead wrong. June 22, 1941 changed everything. Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft smashed across a 1,000-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The attack caught Soviet forces completely off guard. Many Russian pilots were killed, while their planes sat helplessly on airfields. The numbers were staggering. Within days, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and captured. German forces advanced so fast that supply trucks couldn't keep up. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered in the first weeks alone. Hitler boasted that Russia would fall before winter arrived. His generals started planning victory parades in Moscow. But here's where things get darker than anyone imagined. This wasn't just a military campaign. Hitler had given his troops special orders called the Commissar Order. Soviet political officers were to be shot on sight. No prisoners, no mercy. The Nazis viewed Russians as subhuman and treated them accordingly. Then there's the systematic murder that followed the advancing armies. Special killing squads called Einsatzgruppen moved behind the front lines with one purpose: eliminate Jews, communists and intellectuals in occupied territories. They would round up entire communities and shoot them into mass graves. In just one weekend at Babi Yar Ravine, near Kiev, they murdered over 33,000 Jewish civilians. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and became one of history's most brutal episodes. German forces surrounded the city completely, cutting off all food and supplies. The plan was simple: starve the population into submission. What followed was 872 days of unimaginable suffering. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, and sawdust mixed with flour. During the worst winter months, over 100,000 people died from starvation and cold each month in Leningrad alone. Bodies piled up in the streets because survivors lacked strength to bury them. Some families resorted to cannibalism, just to survive another day. Makes you wonder how humans endure such horror, right? The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, unlike anything seen before. German forces initially captured millions of Soviet prisoners, but most died in captivity, from starvation, disease, and execution. Stalin's forces showed equal brutality, shooting their own soldiers who retreated without orders. Winter arrived early and harsh in 1941. German troops, expecting quick victory, lacked proper winter equipment. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Tank engines wouldn't start. Rifles froze solid. Soldiers wrapped themselves in newspapers and rags torn from dead bodies. Soviet losses during the first year alone exceeded 20 million people, more than most countries' entire populations. Entire villages disappeared from maps. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. But across the Pacific, Another sleeping giant was about to be awakened in the most shocking way possible. The war had been raging for over 2 years, but America remained on the sidelines. Sure, they were sending supplies to Britain and making tough speeches about democracy, but actually joining the fight? That was still a bridge too far for most Americans. Pearl Harbor changed everything in exactly 78 minutes. December 7th, 1941 started like any other lazy Sunday morning in Hawaii. Sailors were sleeping off Saturday night hangovers. Officers were planning family barbecues. The biggest worry was whether the coffee would be strong enough. Then, at 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes screamed out of the clouds like metal vultures. The attack was brutally efficient. Japanese pilots had practiced for months, studying detailed maps and photographs of Pearl Harbor. They knew exactly where every battleship was moored, every hangar was located, every fuel depot sat waiting. The element of surprise was so complete that many Americans initially thought it was just a military drill gone wrong. Within minutes, the harbor became a hellscape of twisted metal and burning oil. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that it lifted entirely out of the water before crashing back down. 1,177 sailors died on that single ship. Many were trapped below deck as the massive vessel sank, their screams echoing through the hull until the water silenced them forever. But here's what made the attack even more devastating. It happened while Japanese diplomats were literally sitting in Washington, D.C., pretending to negotiate peace. They were scheduled to deliver Japan's declaration of war just 30 minutes before the bombing began. Technical delays meant the message arrived after the attack had already started. Talk about adding insult to injury. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans died that morning. Another 1,178 were wounded. Entire families received telegrams on the same day, learning that fathers, sons and brothers had perished together. The youngest victim was just 17 years old. The oldest was 68. Death didn't discriminate. Then there's the strategic damage that really hurt. 8 battleships were either sunk or severely damaged. Over 300 aircraft were destroyed, most of them sitting defensively on the ground like ducks in a barrel. Japan had effectively crippled America's Pacific Fleet in less than 2 hours. The audacity was breathtaking. American newspapers the next day carried headlines that still give you chills. War death flies out of Hawaii dawn. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming with bulletins that left families gathered around their sets in stunned silence. President Roosevelt's speech to Congress called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. He wasn't kidding. The attack accomplished something Japan never intended though. It united Americans like nothing else could have. Isolationists who had spent years arguing against foreign wars were suddenly lining up at recruitment offices. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and it was absolutely furious. Within days, America declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on America right back. What had started as a regional conflict in Asia was about to become something far more terrifying. The Pacific would soon run red with blood from battles that would make Pearl Harbor look like a warm-up act. After Pearl Harbor shocked America into the war, Japan wasn't done. They had bigger plans. Much bigger. While Americans were still picking up pieces from their destroyed battleships, Japanese forces were already steamrolling across Southeast Asia like they owned the place. The speed was breathtaking. Within months, Japanese troops had seized Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and were knocking on the door of Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress in the Pacific. It fell faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. February 15, 1942 marked one of Britain's most humiliating defeats ever. General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore, along with 80,000 troops who suddenly found themselves prisoners. But here's the thing about those prisoners. They weren't heading to comfortable camps with 3 meals a day. The Japanese had a very different idea about how to treat captured soldiers. The Bataan Death March became legendary for all the wrong reasons. American and Filipino prisoners were forced to walk 65 miles in blazing heat without food or water. Anyone who stumbled got bayoneted. Anyone who helped a fallen comrade got shot. Thousands died on that march alone. Then there's the matter of what happened in the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur had promised to defend the islands, but reality had other plans. Japanese forces overwhelmed American and Filipino defenders, capturing Manila and forcing a retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. MacArthur himself fled to Australia, leaving behind a famous promise, "I shall return." Nice words, but the soldiers left behind weren't feeling particularly optimistic about their chances. What made Japan's conquest so effective wasn't just military might, it was strategy. They weren't randomly grabbing territory like kids in a candy store. Every target served a purpose. The Dutch East Indies had oil, Malaya had rubber and tin, the Philippines controlled sea lanes. Japan was building an empire designed to feed their war machine. The brutality extended far beyond military targets. In occupied territories, Japanese forces implemented policies that made Nazi occupation look restrained by comparison. Civilians faced forced labor, mass executions, and systematic starvation. Local populations learned quickly that resistance meant death, but cooperation didn't guarantee survival either. Japanese propaganda painted this conquest as liberating Asia from Western colonialism. Asia for Asians sounded noble until you realized it really meant Asia for Japan. Local populations discovered their new masters were often worse than their old ones. At least the British and Dutch hadn't routinely used bayonet practice on civilians. The speed of Japanese expansion created a massive strategic problem for the Allies. Every day brought news of another defeat, another retreat, another temporary tactical withdrawal. American forces found themselves fighting a war they weren't prepared for, in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, against an enemy who seemed unstoppable. Oil became the prize everyone wanted. Japanese control of Southeast Asian oil fields meant they could fuel their war machine while denying resources to the Allies. Smart strategy, except it also meant they'd painted a giant target on their backs. That even as Japan celebrated these stunning victories, storm clouds were gathering across North Africa where another kind of war was brewing. While Europe burned and Asia bled, another theater of war was brewing in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The deserts of North Africa became a chessboard, where tanks replaced pieces and sand dunes became graveyards. The British controlled Egypt, and the vital Suez Canal. The Germans and Italians wanted it, simple as that. Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, arrived in Libya with his Afrika Korps in February 1941. This guy wasn't your typical German general sitting behind a desk. He led from the front, often appearing in battles personally, which either made him brave or completely insane. His tactics were so unpredictable that even his own officers sometimes had no idea what he was planning next. The desert fighting was unlike anything the world had seen before. Forget trenches and forests, this was warfare in an environment that wanted to kill you even before the enemy got a chance. Temperatures soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and plummeted at night. Sand got into everything, weapons jammed, engines failed, and food became a crunchy nightmare. Water was more precious than ammunition, and many soldiers died of dehydration before they ever saw combat. Then there's the logistical madness. Every bullet, every drop of fuel, every can of food had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, then trucked hundreds of miles through hostile territory. Both sides constantly ran out of supplies. Rommel would launch brilliant attacks, then have to stop because his tanks ran out of gas. The British would mount counter-offensives, only to retreat when their supply lines stretched too thin. But the real turning point came at El Alamein, in October 1942. Bernard Montgomery, the British commander, had been building up his forces for months. When the battle began, it was like watching a heavyweight boxing match in slow motion. The fighting lasted 12 days, with both sides pounding each other relentlessly. Artillery barrages lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks. Tank battles raged across miles of desert, leaving burning hulks scattered like broken toys. The casualty numbers tell the brutal story. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in the battles around Tobruk and El Alamein. That's an entire city's worth of people. The Commonwealth forces alone lost 13,500 soldiers, the Germans and Italians. Even worse, they lost 59,000, many of whom would never make it home. What made the Desert War particularly deadly wasn't just the fighting, it was everything else trying to kill you. Landmines turned vast areas into death traps that remained dangerous long after the war ended. Some fields were so densely mined that they're still being cleared today. Disease ran rampant in the heat. Dysentery could incapacitate entire units faster than enemy bullets. After El Alamein, Rommel's Afrika Korps began their long retreat. The Desert Fox had finally been outfoxed. Montgomery's victory marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa, but the human cost had been staggering. While the Desert War was reaching its climax, something far more sinister was taking shape in occupied Europe, a systematic plan that would shock the world. After conquering much of Europe, the Nazi regime didn't just want territory, they wanted to reshape the world according to their twisted racial theories. What started as discrimination quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Jews across occupied Europe found themselves herded into overcrowded ghettos. These weren't neighborhoods, they were open-air prisons. In Warsaw alone, nearly 500,000 people were crammed into just over 1 square mile. Families of 8 squeezed into single rooms. Food rations provided barely 200 calories per day. That's less than a candy bar. But the ghettos were just the beginning. The Nazis had a plan they called the final solution. Sounds bureaucratic, doesn't it? That was intentional. They used clean language to describe the dirtiest crime in human history. Starting in 1942, trains began rolling across Europe with human cargo. People were told they were being resettled for work. Families packed their belongings, thinking they might return someday. They didn't know they were heading to death camps specifically designed for mass murder. Auschwitz became the most notorious of these killing centers. The camp could murder up to 6,000 people daily. Think about that number. Every single day, thousands of mothers, fathers, children and grandparents were killed simply because of their religion or ethnicity. The efficiency was chilling. New arrivals underwent selection. A Nazi doctor would point left or right. Right meant immediate death in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Left meant temporary survival as slave labor. Most people died within hours of arrival. Then there's the systematic nature of it all. The Nazis kept detailed records. They catalogued stolen belongings, gold teeth, even human hair. Nothing was wasted in their industrial approach to genocide. They turned murder into a business model. Camp conditions defied human imagination. Prisoners received starvation rations, watery soup and moldy bread. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks. Guards conducted random beatings and executions for entertainment. Some prisoners were subjected to horrific medical experiments without anesthesia. Children faced particular cruelty. Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele performed gruesome experiments on twins trying to unlock genetic secrets. Most young victims died immediately upon arrival since they couldn't work. Pregnant women were automatically sentenced to death. Well, the scope expanded beyond Jewish victims. Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals also faced persecution and murder. The Nazis targeted anyone who didn't fit their vision of racial purity. By 1943, the killing machine operated at full capacity across occupied territory. Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, each name represents thousands of destroyed lives. Train schedules were coordinated with military precision to maximize the death toll. 6 million Jews died in this systematic genocide. That's roughly the entire population of modern-day Israel. Entire communities vanished forever. Languages died out. Centuries of culture and tradition were erased. But even as this horror unfolded, another massive battle was brewing on the Eastern Front. The city of Stalingrad would soon become the site of the war's bloodiest confrontation. After conquering most of Europe, Hitler made what many consider his biggest mistake. He decided to break his peace treaty with Stalin and attack the Soviet Union. The invasion started in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, but by August 1942, German forces had their sights set on a particular city that would become their graveyard. Stalingrad wasn't just any city, it bore Stalin's name, making it a powerful symbol. Losing it would be like losing Moscow or London. Hitler became obsessed with capturing it, even though his generals warned him it was strategically questionable. Stalin felt the same way about defending it. Two dictators turned this industrial city into the deadliest urban battlefield in human history. The German army arrived in August 1942, confident they'd wrap things up quickly. They'd steamrolled through Poland, France, and half of Russia already. How hard could one city be? They were about to find out exactly how hard. Soviet defenders turned every building into a fortress. Every street became a killing ground. German soldiers would spend days fighting for a single apartment building, only to discover Soviet troops had tunneled underneath and were attacking from behind. The fighting was so close that soldiers could hear enemy conversations through thin walls before trying to kill each other. Winter arrived early and brutal. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because Hitler expected a quick victory, froze to death at their posts, their weapons jammed in the cold. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, better equipped for winter warfare, kept fighting. Then there's the starvation factor. German supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles back to Germany, constantly attacked by Soviet forces. Soldiers ate rats, leather, and anything remotely edible. Some resorted to cannibalism. The Volga River, which runs through Stalingrad, literally turned red with blood from the constant fighting. The city became unrecognizable. Every building was bombed, shelled or burned. Civilians who couldn't escape lived in basements and sewers, emerging like ghosts to scavenge for food. Many didn't survive the crossfire between their supposed liberators and defenders. By November 1942, German forces controlled about 90% of the city. Victory seemed within reach, but that remaining 10% proved impossible to capture. Soviet reinforcements kept crossing the frozen Volga at night, replacing fallen soldiers. The turning point came when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack that surrounded the entire German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in the city they thought they'd conquered. Hitler refused to let them retreat, ordering them to fight to the last man. The siege lasted 200 days total. When it finally ended in February 1943, over 2 million people had died. The German Sixth Army, once considered invincible, surrendered with only 91,000 survivors out of the original 250,000. Most of these prisoners would never see Germany again, but Stalingrad marked more than just a German defeat. It proved that Hitler's war machine could be stopped, reversed and destroyed. The victory gave the Soviet Union momentum that would carry them all the way to Berlin. Yet even as this battle ended, another kind of horror was unfolding across the Pacific, where island warfare would test human endurance in entirely different ways. The war in Europe was grinding through brutal city battles and frozen trenches, but halfway around the world, a completely different kind of hell was unfolding. Picture trying to fight a war on chunks of rock scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, where every single piece of land had to be won with blood. The Pacific wasn't like the sweeping tank battles of North Africa, or the street fighting in Stalingrad. This was something else entirely. Each island became its own miniature war, and the Japanese weren't about to give up easily. They'd had years to dig in, turning tropical paradises into death traps with hidden bunkers, underground tunnels and artillery positions carved right into the rock. Guadalcanal kicked things off in August 1942. What was supposed to be a quick operation stretched into 6 months of pure misery. American forces found themselves fighting not just Japanese soldiers, but malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot that literally ate away at their skin. The Japanese called it Starvation Island, because neither side could get enough supplies through. Soldiers on both sides were reduced to eating grass and tree bark. The weird part, some nights you could hear enemy troops just 50 yards away, dying from the same diseases that were killing your buddies. Then came Tarawa, in 1943. 24 square miles of coral that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. They boasted it would take 1 million Americans 100 years to capture it. Well, it took 76 hours and cost 3,000 American casualties. The entire lagoon turned red with blood, and bodies floated in the surf for days. Makes you wonder if those Japanese commanders were doing their math right. But nothing compared to Iwo Jima, in 1945. 8 square miles of volcanic rock that became the deadliest piece of real estate in the Pacific. The Japanese had 11 miles of underground tunnels and could pop up anywhere to attack. American casualties hit 26,000 in just 36 days, that famous photo of soldiers raising the flag. 3 of those 6 men died before the battle even ended. Let's not forget the kamikaze pilots who started showing up everywhere. Young Japanese men, barely out of their teens, diving their planes directly into American ships. Over 3,800 kamikaze attacks killed more than 7,000 Allied sailors. These weren't desperate last-minute tactics either. The Japanese were training thousands of pilots specifically to die, complete with farewell ceremonies and final letters home. The tropical diseases were almost as deadly as the bullets. Malaria knocked out entire units. Dengue fever caused soldiers to hallucinate. Some islands had poisonous snakes and spiders that killed more men than Japanese snipers did. Food rotted within hours in the humidity. Fresh water was often contaminated with corpses or chemicals. What made these battles particularly brutal was that surrender wasn't really an option for Japanese forces. Their military code demanded death before dishonor, which meant every position had to be taken by force. No negotiations, no white flags, just fighting until literally everyone was dead. And speaking of brutal tactics and unwavering determination, the Japanese approach to warfare extended far beyond just these island battles. Their treatment of prisoners and civilians revealed an even darker side to this Pacific conflict. While millions of soldiers battled across continents, ordinary people trapped behind enemy lines faced their own deadly choice. Submit to occupation or fight back. Many chose resistance, knowing full well what awaited them if caught. The underground movements that sprouted across occupied Europe weren't led by professional soldiers. They were teachers, shopkeepers, students and farmers who couldn't stomach watching their countries destroyed. These amateur fighters developed into sophisticated networks that made the Nazis' lives miserable. They blew up railway lines carrying German supplies, sabotaged bridges, cut telephone wires, assassinated collaborators. But here's what made resistance so terrifying. The consequences weren't just personal. When partisans killed a German officer, entire villages paid the price. The Nazi policy was brutally simple: kill 10 civilians for every German soldier killed. Sometimes they burned entire towns to the ground. Women, children, elderly people. Nobody was spared these reprisals. Take the Czech village of Lidis. After resistance fighters assassinated Nazi leader Reinhard Heydrich in Prague, the Germans decided to make an example. They murdered every man in Lidis, deported all the women and children to concentration camps. Then they literally erased the village from existence, bulldozing every building and planting crops over the ruins. The message was clear: resist us, and this is what happens. Yet people kept fighting anyway. The Polish Home Army became one of the largest resistance movements, with over 300,000 members by 1944. They staged the famous Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, believing Soviet forces would help them liberate their capital. For 63 days, Polish fighters battled German troops street by street. The Soviets never came. Over 200,000 Polish civilians died, and the Germans systematically destroyed what remained of Warsaw after crushing the uprising. French resistance fighters proved equally resourceful, though they learned to be more careful about reprisals. They developed elaborate codes, safe houses and escape routes. When D-Day approached, French partisans provided crucial intelligence about German defenses. They also sabotaged communications at exactly the right moment, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches quickly. The weird part is how ordinary people transformed into deadly operators. A librarian would memorize train schedules by day, then plant explosives on tracks by night. A baker would hide weapons in flour sacks. Grandmothers would smuggle messages sewn into their clothing. These weren't action movie heroes. They were regular folks who got very good at very dangerous work. Soviet partisans operated differently, often with direct support from Moscow. They controlled vast areas of forest and swampland behind German lines. Some partisan groups grew so large they functioned like shadow armies, with their own hospitals, workshops and supply systems. German forces had to dedicate hundreds of thousands of troops just to fight these irregular forces. The psychological pressure was enormous. Resistance fighters lived with constant fear, not just for themselves but for their families and neighbors who might suffer if they were caught. Torture was standard practice for captured partisans. Many carried poison pills rather than risk talking under interrogation. Despite the horrific costs, these underground movements proved that occupied populations weren't helpless victims. They tied down German resources, gathered vital intelligence, and kept hope alive. However, their activities would soon pale in comparison to the systematic horrors being committed in another theater of war entirely. While Europe burned under Nazi occupation, the Japanese military was writing its own horrific chapter across Asia. Their approach to warfare went far beyond conventional battles. They systematically enslaved, tortured and murdered millions of civilians in ways that still shock historians today. The numbers alone tell a devastating story. Around 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery as comfort women. These weren't volunteers or prostitutes. They were kidnapped girls as young as 12, tricked with promises of factory work, then imprisoned in military brothels across the Pacific. Many never made it home, but that was just the beginning. Unit 731, operating in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, conducted medical experiments that make horror movies seem tame. They infected prisoners with plague, anthrax and cholera to study disease progression. They performed surgery without anesthesia. They froze limbs to test frostbite treatments, then thawed them to watch the tissue die. The victims, Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, and anyone the Japanese considered expendable. Dr. Shiro Ishii, who ran Unit 731, called his test subjects logs, not even human in his twisted mind. His team dissected living people to see how diseases affected internal organs. They tested biological weapons on entire villages. Over 10,000 people died in these experiments. And that's just what we know about. Then there's Manila. When American forces closed in on the Philippine capital in 1945, Japanese troops went berserk. For a month they slaughtered civilians street by street, babies bayoneted in front of their mothers, Families burned alive in churches where they'd sought sanctuary. Over 100,000 civilians died, more than both atomic bombs combined. The Bataan Death March became another symbol of Japanese brutality. After capturing American and Filipino troops in 1942, Japanese forces marched 75,000 prisoners, 65 miles in blazing heat. No food, no water. Anyone who collapsed got bayoneted or shot. Thousands died on that march alone. Japanese prison camps made Nazi camps look merciful by comparison. Allied prisoners faced starvation rations, a handful of rice daily. They worked in mines, built railways through jungles, and hauled supplies until they dropped dead. The survival rate, about 50%. Guards beat prisoners for sport, forced them to bow to Japanese flags, and executed anyone who showed defiance. What makes this even more disturbing? Japanese society back home knew nothing about these atrocities. Their newspapers showed heroic soldiers fighting for the emperor, not the reality of systematic torture and murder happening across their empire. The weird part is how organized it all was. This wasn't random violence or soldiers losing control. Japanese military leaders planned these atrocities, documented them, and rewarded officers who carried them out effectively. They treated human experimentation like any other military research project. Well, while Japanese forces terrorized Asia through organized brutality, back in Europe, ordinary families faced their own nightmare, one that would leave entire populations starving and homeless for years. The bombs had stopped falling, but the suffering was far from over. Across Europe and Asia, 20 million people found themselves with nowhere to go. Their homes were gone. Their cities looked like moonscapes. Some didn't even know if their families were alive. Wars destroy more than just armies. They tear apart the very fabric of normal life, leaving millions wandering through the wreckage of what used to be civilization. In Poland alone, nearly 1/3 of all homes had been reduced to rubble. People who once had comfortable lives now lived in cellars, abandoned schools, or makeshift tents in the middle of winter. The lucky ones made it to refugee camps. But lucky is a relative term here. These camps were drowning in new arrivals every single day. Families slept on dirt floors with nothing but thin blankets between them and the cold ground. Food was scarce, clean water even scarcer. Disease spread like wildfire through the overcrowded conditions. Then there were the children. Thousands of them wandered through destroyed cities completely alone. Their parents were dead, missing, or separated by the chaos of war. These kids, some as young as 5 or 6, learned to scavenge for scraps of food in bombed-out buildings. They slept in doorways, subway tunnels, anywhere they could find shelter from the wind and rain. Rationing had been going on for years by this point, but it got worse as the war dragged on. Families in Britain received just 2 ounces of butter per week. 2 ounces, that's barely enough to butter a few slices of bread. In Germany, people were eating turnips and potato peels. In occupied territories, it was even grimmer. Many survived on thin soup made from whatever they could find. The weird part is how quickly people adapted to this nightmare. Mothers learned to make coffee from acorns and meat from whatever protein they could scrounge up. Children played games in bomb craters like they were playgrounds. Human beings have this incredible ability to find normalcy, even in the most abnormal circumstances. But let's not forget the psychological toll. Entire communities had been uprooted and scattered across continents. Grandparents died alone because their families had been evacuated hundreds of miles away. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of new borders drawn by conquering armies. Relief organizations tried their best, but they were completely overwhelmed. The Red Cross, religious groups, and volunteer organizations worked around the clock. But what do you do when the scale of suffering is beyond anything the world had ever seen? It was like trying to empty an ocean with a teacup. Some refugees spent years in camps, waiting for news about relatives or for some country to accept them. Others walked hundreds of miles searching for family members, carrying everything they owned in a single suitcase or bundle. The human cost of this massive displacement would echo for generations. But even as millions struggled just to survive each day, the machinery of war continued grinding forward, bringing new horrors from the skies above. The logic seemed simple enough. Hit enemy cities hard, and they'll surrender faster. But the reality of strategic bombing in World War II turned into something far more devastating than military planners ever anticipated. When Allied bombers first took to the skies over Germany and Japan, they promised precision strikes on factories and military targets. That promise didn't last long. Dresden changed everything. February 13, 1945, the city was packed with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Then came the bombers. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft dropped incendiary bombs that created a firestorm so intense it literally sucked oxygen from the air. People in bomb shelters suffocated without a single flame touching them. Others who tried to flee found the streets melting beneath their feet. Over 25,000 people died in just a few days. The Baroque city, known as the Florence of the North, became a smoldering wasteland. But Dresden wasn't alone in its suffering. Hamburg faced Operation Gomorrah in 1943, where bombing created temperatures of 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees exploded from the heat. Glass windows turned into deadly projectiles flying through the air. 40,000 people died, and the survivors described scenes that seemed pulled from hell itself. Mass panic gripped the city, as families were separated in the chaos, never to reunite. The Pacific Theater saw even more devastating attacks. Tokyo's firebombing on March 9, 1945, killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb would later claim. 100,000 civilians died, as paper houses became death traps. The attack was specifically designed to target residential areas where workers lived. General Curtis LeMay, who planned the raid, later admitted they were scorching and boiling and baking to death more people in Tokyo than in any other raid in history. What made these attacks particularly brutal was their targeting. While military leaders claimed they aimed for strategic targets, the reality was different. Homes, schools, hospitals, and even churches found themselves in the crosshairs. The theory was simple: destroy civilian morale, and the enemy government will collapse. Break their spirit, and you won't need to break their armies. German cities like Cologne, Essen, and Düsseldorf faced repeated raids that left millions homeless. Children learned to identify different aircraft by their engine sounds. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. Families spent entire nights huddled in basements, emerging to find their neighborhoods transformed into landscapes of rubble and twisted metal. The bombing campaigns raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare itself. Were these strategic necessities or war crimes? The answer often depended on which side you asked. Allied commanders argued they were shortening the war and saving lives in the long run. German and Japanese survivors saw only mass murder from the sky. These aerial bombardments reshaped how wars would be fought forever. They proved that no civilian was truly safe from modern conflict. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred beyond recognition. Yet even as cities burned from above, another horror was unfolding on the ground, one that would prove even more systematic and deliberate in its cruelty. The systematic murder was horrifying enough, but the concentration camps revealed humanity at its absolute worst. These weren't just prisons, they were factories designed to break human beings before killing them. Picture arriving at Auschwitz after days crammed in a cattle car with no food or water. The smell hit you first, a mixture of burning flesh, human waste and death that survivors said you could never forget. Guards separated families immediately. Children torn from mothers, husbands from wives, most would never see each other again. The Nazis didn't just want to kill people quickly. That would have been too merciful. They wanted to strip away every shred of human dignity first. Prisoners had their heads shaved, their clothes taken, their names replaced with numbers tattooed on their arms. The message was clear: you are no longer human. Daily life became a nightmare of calculated cruelty. Wake-up calls at 4 a.m., 12-hour work shifts on starvation rations. A bowl of watery soup and a piece of moldy bread had to last all day. Prisoners fought over scraps like animals, which was exactly what the guards wanted. Then there were the medical experiments. Dr. Schoss Mengele became infamous for his twisted research on twins, injecting chemicals into their eyes to change color, performing surgeries without anesthesia. Children were his favorite subjects. Some prisoners were frozen alive to test hypothermia treatments. Others were infected with diseases to study their effects. The gas chambers represented industrial-scale murder. Victims were told they were going for showers. They were handed soap and towels to maintain the deception. Only when the doors locked and the Zyklon B gas started flowing, did they realize the truth. Within 20 minutes, everyone inside was dead. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The camps operated like businesses. Prisoner hair was collected to make textiles. Gold teeth were melted down. Even the ashes were used as fertilizer. The Nazis turned genocide into a profit center. Not everyone died in gas chambers though. Many were simply worked to death. The phrase "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free, was displayed at camp entrances. Dark irony considering work was just another form of execution, stretched out over months instead of minutes. Survival required impossible choices. Prisoners sometimes had to help load bodies into crematoriums to earn extra food. Parents watched their children die, knowing that crying too loudly might get them killed too. Some prisoners became capos mas guards who brutalized their fellow inmates for slightly better treatment. Liberation came too late for most. When Allied soldiers finally opened the camps in 1945, they found living skeletons barely able to stand. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves containing thousands of victims. The survivors faced a cruel irony. They had endured hell to stay alive, but returning to normal life proved nearly impossible. Many discovered their entire families had been murdered. Yet somehow, some found the strength to rebuild their lives and tell their stories. Their testimonies became crucial evidence of what happens when hatred goes unchecked and ordinary people choose to look the other way. Speaking of looking the other way, children across occupied Europe faced their own unimaginable horrors. While adults faced unimaginable horrors during World War II, children bore a particularly cruel burden. They didn't choose this war, yet they suffered its worst consequences in ways that would haunt survivors forever. The Nazis didn't spare children from their twisted experiments. At camps like Auschwitz, doctors injected dyes into children's eyes to see if they could change their color permanently. Kids as young as 5 were subjected to freezing experiments, sterilization procedures, and surgical operations without anesthesia. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, had a sick fascination with twins. He would perform gruesome experiments on one twin while keeping the other as a control group. Most didn't survive. But the horrors extended far beyond the camps. In occupied territories, children were torn from their families and shipped off to work in German factories. A 12-year-old Polish boy might find himself assembling ammunition 14 hours a day, his small fingers perfect for delicate work. No school, no play, no childhood, just endless labor until exhaustion took over. The hunger was perhaps worse than the work. Children in besieged cities like Leningrad learned to eat tree bark and leather shoes. Their growth stunted permanently. In the Warsaw Ghetto, kids became so thin you could see every bone in their bodies. Some weighed less at age 10 than they had at age 6. Then there's the psychological trauma that never really healed. Children watched their parents dragged away by soldiers, never to return. A 6-year-old might wake up one morning to find their entire family gone, leaving them to wander bombed-out streets alone. These kids learned to scavenge for food like wild animals, hiding in basements and ruins. The Kindertransport program managed to rescue about 10,000 Jewish children from Nazi territory, sending them to safety in Britain. Sounds heroic, right? Well, imagine being a 7-year-old, unable to speak English, handed over to strangers while your parents disappeared forever. Many of these rescued children spent decades wondering if their families had survived. Japanese children faced their own nightmares. In cities like Manila, kids were bayoneted alongside their parents during massacres. Some were forced to watch their mothers become comfort women for Japanese soldiers. The trauma created an entire generation that would never fully recover from what they witnessed. The weird part is how children adapted. They created games out of survival. Kids in London bomb shelters invented songs about air raids. Children in concentration camps shared imaginary feasts, describing elaborate meals they'd never tasted. Their resilience was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Many children never learned basic skills like reading or writing because schools were destroyed or converted into military barracks. An entire generation lost their education, their innocence, and often their lives before they even had a chance to live. By war's end, millions of children had been orphaned, traumatized, or killed outright. The lucky ones who survived carried invisible scars that would affect them for decades to come. While these children suffered on land, another deadly battle was raging across the ocean's vast expanse. The North Atlantic became a killing field, unlike any other during World War II. German U-boats lurked beneath the waves like hungry sharks, turning merchant ships into floating coffins. Over 2,700 Allied vessels went to the bottom of the ocean, taking precious cargo and thousands of lives with them. Picture this nightmare scenario: you're a merchant sailor carrying supplies to Britain, knowing that somewhere below the dark waters, enemy submarines are hunting you. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, offering nowhere to hide. When torpedoes struck, sailors had maybe minutes to abandon ship before disappearing into the icy depths. Many never made it to the lifeboats. The numbers tell a brutal story. 72,000 Allied seamen lost their lives in these freezing waters, often dying slowly from hypothermia as rescue ships searched desperately for survivors. Some floated for days on makeshift rafts, watching their shipmates succumb to the cold one by one. The lucky ones died quickly when their ships exploded. Britain's survival hung by a thread during 1942. German submarines were so effective that British imports dropped by half. Food became scarce, fuel ran low, and ammunition supplies dwindled. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat scared him more than German bombers over London. Makes sense, right? You can rebuild bombed cities, but a starving island nation faces extinction. Admiral Karl Donitz commanded Germany's submarine fleet with ruthless efficiency. His Wolf-Pack tactics revolutionized naval warfare. Multiple U-boats would coordinate attacks on convoy routes, overwhelming escort ships through sheer numbers. One convoy lost 22 ships in a single night. The ocean burned with fuel, oil, and debris for hours afterward. Well, the Allies weren't sitting idle while ships disappeared. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked around the clock to crack German naval communications. When they finally broke the Enigma code, everything changed. Allied commanders could predict U-boat positions and route convoys around submarine patrol areas. Technology turned the tide in unexpected ways. Improved sonar systems helped escort ships detect submarines hiding below. Long-range aircraft equipped with depth charges began patrolling convoy routes, forcing U-boats to stay submerged and reducing their effectiveness. Radar installations spotted enemy periscopes on the surface during night attacks. Then there's the human cost beyond the statistics. Entire families lost fathers and sons to torpedo attacks. Maritime communities from Liverpool to Halifax watched their young men sail away, never knowing who would return. Some ships carried refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe, adding civilian casualties to military losses. The weird part is how routine these deadly voyages became. Sailors developed dark humor about swimming with the fishes and made bets on whether their convoy would reach port intact. They had to laugh. The alternative was paralyzing fear. German submarine crews faced their own nightmares as Allied anti-submarine warfare improved. The hunters became the hunted, with depth charges exploding around their steel coffins hundreds of feet underwater. Most U-boat crews never survived the war. But even as the Battle of the Atlantic raged across thousands of miles of ocean, another horror was unfolding on land that would surpass even these maritime tragedies. As the war dragged into its final months, something absolutely horrific began happening across Nazi-occupied Europe. Prisoners who had somehow survived years in concentration camps suddenly found themselves being marched out at gunpoint. Why? The Allies were closing in fast, and the Nazis needed to hide the evidence. These weren't casual walks through the countryside. Prisoners were forced to march over 50 miles with zero food, carrying whatever pathetic belongings they had left. Guards shot anyone who slowed down or collapsed. No questions asked, no mercy shown. The timing made everything worse. Many of these death marches happened during the brutal winter of 1944-45, when temperatures dropped well below freezing. Prisoners who had already been starved for months now trudged through snow and ice, many without proper shoes. Some walked completely barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow behind them. Guards didn't care if you were sick, injured, or dying. Fall behind. You got a bullet. Try to help a fellow prisoner. Both of you might get shot. The math was simple and terrifying. Keep walking or die right here on the roadside. Then there's the sheer scale of this nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were forced into these marches as camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau were evacuated. The roads of Eastern Europe became death traps lined with frozen corpses. Some survivors later described eating snow just to get moisture in their mouths. Others talked about prisoners who simply sat down in the snow knowing they would die because they couldn't take another step. The human body can only endure so much, and these people had already endured years of hell. But here's what makes it even more twisted. Many of these marches led absolutely nowhere useful. Guards would march prisoners from one camp, only to find that camp was also being evacuated. So they'd march them somewhere else, and somewhere else again. It was chaos disguised as a plan. The lucky ones were prisoners whose camps got liberated before the marches began. Allied soldiers would arrive to find gates thrown open and guards fled, but thousands of empty barracks told the story. The prisoners were already gone, somewhere out there on the frozen roads. Weather became another killer. Prisoners who survived typhus, starvation, and years of torture finally died from exposure during a 3-day march through a blizzard. Bodies were left where they fell because nobody had the strength to bury them. Yet somehow some people made it. They walked for weeks, survived on nothing, watched friends die beside them, and still kept going. When Allied forces finally found these march survivors, many were more dead than alive. The death marches only ended when camps were finally liberated, and the Nazi system completely collapsed. But by then tens of thousands more had died just miles away from potential freedom. These weren't the only people desperately trying to stay alive as the war reached its bloody conclusion. Across occupied Europe, neighbors were making choices that would haunt them forever. While bombs fell and bullets flew, some of the war's most devastating wounds came from betrayal. Trust became a luxury few could afford when neighbors sold each other out for a loaf of bread. Occupied countries faced a brutal choice: resist and watch your family die, or collaborate and maybe survive another day. The math was ugly but simple. Puppet governments sprouted across Europe like weeds after rain. Vichy France, led by Marshal Pétain, became Hitler's willing partner. Norway's Vidkun Quisling gave his name to traitors everywhere. His eager cooperation with Nazi occupiers made Quisling synonymous with betrayal. But the real horror happened on street corners and in apartment buildings. Ordinary people turned informant for surprisingly little. A Jewish family hiding in Amsterdam. Someone called the authorities for pocket change. Resistance fighters planning to blow up railway tracks. A worried shopkeeper made a phone call. The rewards were modest. Extra food rations, a warm coat, maybe just the promise that your own children wouldn't be taken. Anna Frank's family hid for 2 years before someone betrayed their location. Nobody knows exactly who made that call, but theories still swirl decades later. Was it a warehouse employee needing money? A neighbor who noticed too much food being bought? The anonymity made it worse. Anyone could be the enemy. Then there's the flip side of collaboration. Those who helped willingly, not just for survival. French police rounded up Jews with enthusiasm that shocked even their German handlers. They arrested 13,000 people during the Velde Roundup in July 1942. Children as young as 2 years old were separated from their parents and shipped east to death camps. Lithuanian and Ukrainian volunteers joined SS units to hunt down their Jewish neighbors. They knew the local hiding spots, spoke the language, understood family connections. Their local knowledge made them deadlier than foreign occupiers ever could be. Makes sense, right? Who better to catch rebels than someone who grew up on the same streets? Some collaboration was purely opportunistic. Business owners discovered that Nazi contracts paid well. Factory managers found that slave labor boosted profits nicely. French factories produced trucks for the German army. Dutch companies built fortifications along the Atlantic coast. Everyone had bills to pay. After all, the psychological damage lasted longer than physical wounds. Survivors spent decades wondering which neighbors had betrayed them. Communities split apart by suspicion never fully healed. Wedding invitations became awkward when half the guest list had informed on the other half. Post-war trials tried to sort heroes from villains, but the lines weren't always clear. A woman who slept with German officers to protect her children, collaborator, or desperate mother. A mayor who followed Nazi orders to prevent his town's destruction, traitor, or pragmatist. French authorities arrested 300,000 suspected collaborators after liberation. Many had their heads shaved publicly. Some were shot without trial. Justice and revenge blurred together in those chaotic months. While betrayals tore communities apart, Nazi doctors were conducting their own form of human destruction. Their medical experiments would reveal depths of cruelty that challenged basic understanding of human nature. Nazi doctors turned medicine into horror. They threw away everything doctors are supposed to stand for. First, do no harm. They did nothing but harm. Dr. Joseph Mengele became the most infamous of these monsters. At Auschwitz, prisoners called him the Angel of Death. When new trains arrived, he'd stand on the platform deciding who lived and who died. But his real evil came later. In his laboratory, Mengele had an obsession with twins. He'd select twin children from the camps and conduct experiments that would make your stomach turn. He injected dye into their eyes, trying to change their color permanently. Many children went blind. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, removing organs to see how twins differed internally. Most died on his table. Then there were the freezing experiments. Nazi doctors wanted to know how long German pilots could survive if shot down over cold water. So they dunked prisoners in ice water for hours. They measured how long it took for body temperature to drop to deadly levels. Hundreds died slowly from hypothermia, while doctors took notes. High-altitude experiments were equally brutal. Doctors locked prisoners in chambers and rapidly changed air pressure to simulate high-altitude conditions. They wanted to know what happened when pilots ejected at extreme heights. Prisoners' lungs burst, their eardrums exploded. But hey, at least they got data right. Some experiments targeted specific groups. Sterilization procedures were tested on Jewish women and Roma prisoners. Doctors injected chemicals into their reproductive organs or exposed them to massive doses of X-rays. The goal was finding efficient ways to sterilize entire populations. Many women died from infections or radiation poisoning. Chemical weapons testing used prisoners as human guinea pigs. They'd expose people to mustard gas, phosgene and other deadly chemicals. Doctors wanted to see how much exposure soldiers could handle before dying. They'd inflict chemical burns and watch how they healed, or didn't heal. Japanese Unit 731 operated even more horrifically in China. They called prisoners logs instead of people. Makes it easier to sleep at night apparently. They infected prisoners with plague, cholera, and anthrax, then dissected them while still alive to see how diseases progressed. They froze prisoners' limbs, then thawed them to study frostbite treatment. Biological warfare experiments involved releasing plague-infected fleas into Chinese cities. Unit 731 wanted to see how effectively disease could wipe out enemy populations. Entire villages died while Japanese doctors observed from a safe distance. The worst part, most of these doctors faced no consequences. Many Nazi physicians escaped to South America, or were quietly recruited by Allied intelligence agencies. Their research was considered too valuable to lose. Justice took a back seat to scientific curiosity. Some experiments served no medical purpose whatsoever. They were pure sadism dressed up as science. Doctors would break prisoners' bones repeatedly to see how many times they could heal. They'd perform unnecessary amputations just to practice surgical techniques. Medical ethics died in those camps alongside millions of victims. But while doctors were destroying human dignity in their laboratories, ordinary people across occupied territories were making a different choice entirely. While regular armies fought their conventional battles, another war was happening in the shadows. Partisan warfare turned ordinary civilians into deadly fighters who could strike without warning and disappear like ghosts. These weren't trained soldiers with fancy uniforms. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers and students who decided they'd rather die fighting than live under occupation. The beauty of guerrilla tactics. You don't need tanks or bombers. A few sticks of dynamite could derail an entire supply train. A cut telephone wire could blind enemy communications for hours. Soviet partisans became masters at this deadly game, operating behind German lines like a constant, nagging headache that wouldn't go away. But here's where things get really interesting. Women weren't just supporting these operations. They were leading them. Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko killed over 300 German soldiers. French resistance fighter Nancy Wake coordinated supply drops and led armed raids. These women proved that when your homeland is threatened, gender roles become pretty meaningless. Yugoslav partisans took guerrilla warfare to the next level. They tied down entire German divisions that could have been fighting elsewhere. Josip Broz Tito's forces weren't just hiding in the woods taking potshots. They were running a parallel government, complete with hospitals, schools and courts. The Germans found themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire shadow nation. Then there's the French resistance, probably the most romanticized partisan movement in history. Reality was far grittier than the movies suggest. These fighters lived with constant fear, knowing that capture meant torture and death. They developed elaborate codes, secret meeting spots and networks so complex that even they didn't know all the players. The price of resistance was absolutely brutal. For every German soldier killed by partisans, the Nazis would execute 10 or more civilians. Entire villages got wiped off the map as punishment. The German massacre at Oradour Glen killed 642 people, including 247 children, just to send a message. What made partisan warfare so psychologically devastating was its unpredictability. German soldiers never knew if the old woman selling bread was gathering intelligence, or if the helpful farmer giving directions was leading them into an ambush. Paranoia became a constant companion. Polish partisans faced perhaps the worst conditions of all. Caught between Nazi brutality and Soviet oppression, they fought both occupying forces. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 showed incredible courage but ended in catastrophe, with 200,000 civilians killed and the city systematically destroyed. Soviet partisan operations were massive in scale. Over 100,000 fighters operated behind enemy lines, supported by airdrops and radio communications from Moscow. They destroyed bridges, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators with ruthless efficiency. Some areas became completely uninhabitable for German forces. The countryside bore the heaviest cost of this shadow war. Entire regions were depopulated as civilians fled the constant cycle of attack and reprisal. Villages that had existed for centuries simply vanished, their populations scattered or dead. But even as partisan warfare extracted its terrible price, something else was happening that would prove equally devastating to civilian populations. Empty stomachs don't care about politics or borders, they just growl, demanding food that isn't there. During World War II, hunger became a weapon as deadly as bullets, used by armies to break spirits and entire populations. In Leningrad, people discovered just how creative desperation could make them. The siege lasted 872 days, and by winter 1941, residents were eating wallpaper paste, leather belts and soap. Rats became delicacies. Pet cats disappeared first, then dogs. Some families kept their deceased relatives in unheated rooms, preserving the bodies in the freezing cold until they could arrange proper burials. The dead often looked better fed than the living. But here's the twisted part: Nazi planners actually calculated this misery. They called it the Hunger Plan, designed to starve 30 million Slavs to make room for German settlers. Bureaucrats sat in warm offices, drawing up charts showing how many calories each occupied population should receive. Spoiler alert, it wasn't enough to survive. The numbers were coldly precise. Soviet prisoners of war received 700 calories daily, cas of what a sedentary person needs just to maintain basic body functions. Ukrainian farmers, the people who grew Europe's grain, were allocated 420 calories per day. That's less than a modern energy drink and a granola bar combined. Then there's the Bengal famine of 1943, where British policies diverted food supplies to support the war effort. 3 million Indians starved while rice sat in warehouses, waiting for shipment to British troops. Winston Churchill allegedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. Real compassionate leadership there. Japanese-occupied territories faced similar horrors. In the Philippines, civilians survived on grass soup and tree bark. The Japanese military followed a living-off-the-land policy, which sounds sustainable until you realize it meant stealing every grain of rice from local families. Filipino children forgot what it felt like to have full bellies, even in concentration camps. The Nazis weaponized hunger with scientific precision. Prisoners in Auschwitz received about 1,300 calories daily while performing hard labor that burned 3,000 calories. The math was simple: slow death by starvation while maintaining just enough strength for slave labor. Efficiency at its most evil. What's heartbreaking is how people adapted. Mothers in Warsaw taught their children that potato peels were treats. French families celebrated when they found a single egg. Dutch children born during the hunger winter of 1944 grew up permanently affected, their bodies forever changed by malnutrition experienced in the womb. Some communities fought back through food networks. Polish nuns smuggled bread into ghettos. Norwegian fishermen secretly distributed their catch to starving neighbors. These small acts of defiance kept hope alive when governments had abandoned their people. The psychological impact lasted decades. Survivors hoarded food for the rest of their lives, unable to throw away even moldy bread. Many never fully trusted that their next meal was guaranteed, because they'd learned the hard way that civilization was always just 9 missed meals away from collapse. Speaking of psychological warfare, the Axis powers had perfected another form of breaking human spirits, turning neighbor against neighbor through betrayal and collaboration. As the war reached its final stages, something interesting happened. The very people who had seemed untouchable for years suddenly found themselves facing the ultimate price. Power, it turns out, doesn't last forever. Benito Mussolini learned this lesson the hard way in April 1945. The man who had once strutted around like a peacock, declaring himself the new Caesar, was now hiding in the back of a German truck wearing a Wehrmacht overcoat. Pretty embarrassing for someone who used to give speeches from balconies to cheering crowds. Italian partisans caught him trying to flee to Switzerland. They didn't waste time with fancy trials or lengthy procedures. On April 28, 1945, they executed Mussolini and his mistress Clara Petacci near Lake Como, but the story doesn't end there. The partisans hung their bodies upside down at a gas station in Milan, letting angry crowds spit on them and throw rocks. The same people who once saluted Il Duce were now celebrating his death in the streets. Then there's the question of what happened to other collaborators across Europe. French authorities executed Pierre Laval, the prime minister who had eagerly helped the Nazis. Norwegian Vidkun Quisling Kunsho, whose name literally became synonymous with traitor, faced a firing squad in October 1945. Makes sense, right? Well, not everyone waited around for justice to catch up with them. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, bit down on a cyanide capsule when British soldiers captured him. Hermann Göring did the same thing just hours before his scheduled execution at Nuremberg. Joseph Goebbels and his wife killed their 6 children before taking their own lives in Hitler's bunker. These weren't acts of honor, they were desperate attempts to avoid facing the consequences of their crimes. Japanese war criminals faced a different kind of reckoning. General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into the Pacific War, tried to shoot himself when American soldiers came to arrest him. He botched the job and survived, only to face trial and execution later. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East sentenced 7 Japanese leaders to death, including Tojo, who was hanged in December 1948. But here's what's really striking about this period. Ordinary people were also settling scores. Across occupied Europe, civilians who had suffered under collaborationist governments took justice into their own hands. French women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through towns naked. Romanian Iron Guard members were lynched by angry mobs. The weird part is how quickly these supposedly powerful regimes collapsed once their leaders were gone. Governments that had seemed so strong and permanent crumbled within days. Puppet administrations that had ruled with iron fists suddenly found themselves with no protection whatsoever. New governments moved in to fill the vacuum left by fallen dictators, but removing the old leadership was just the beginning of a much longer process. The question wasn't just who would replace these fallen tyrants, but how entire nations would rebuild after years of brutality and occupation. And that rebuilding would soon face its own deadly challenge in the form of one final desperate battle. By April 1945, Berlin was a city living on borrowed time. Hitler's grand capital had become a concrete maze of rubble, broken dreams, and desperate people. The Soviets weren't just knocking on the door anymore. They'd kicked it down and were storming through the hallways. The Red Army had completely surrounded the city. No escape routes, no cavalry coming to save the day. Over 2 million Soviet troops pressed in from all sides, their artillery pounding German positions into dust. The sound never stopped. Constant thunder that made windows vibrate and eardrums bleed. Well, you'd think this would be when Hitler finally admitted defeat. Instead, he doubled down on his delusions. From his underground bunker, he kept issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Send in the reserves, he'd scream. What reserves? Most of his soldiers were teenagers and old men clutching rusty rifles. Then there's the bizarre part about the fighting itself. This wasn't some clean military operation with neat battle lines. Soviet troops had to fight building by building, room by room, floor by floor. German defenders turned apartment blocks into fortresses. Every stairwell became a battleground. Every cellar held potential ambush. The civilian population, trapped in the middle of this urban nightmare, around 125,000 Berlin residents would die during this final battle. Many huddled in subway tunnels that became underground refugee camps. Others couldn't escape their apartments as artillery shells crashed through their roofs. But here's what made it even more horrific. Hitler ordered the destruction of Berlin's own infrastructure. Bridges blown up, water systems destroyed, gas lines cut. He figured, if he couldn't have his precious capital, nobody could. His own people meant nothing to him anymore. Soviet soldiers weren't exactly showing mercy either. Years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front had hardened them beyond recognition. They'd seen their families murdered, their cities burned, their comrades tortured. Now they wanted payback. The revenge was swift and merciless. By late April, the noose had tightened completely. Soviet tanks rolled down streets lined with burning buildings. Machine gun fire echoed off collapsed walls. The smell of smoke, cordite, and death hung over everything like a toxic fog. Makes sense that Hitler finally cracked under this pressure, right? On April 30th, as Soviet troops fought just blocks from his bunker, he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Eva Braun, his new wife of barely 24 hours, took poison beside him. Their bodies were burned in the bunker courtyard, while shells exploded overhead. Even with their leader dead, some German units kept fighting. Old habits die hard. But resistance crumbled quickly once word spread. Berlin officially fell on May 2nd, 1945. The city that once hosted massive Nazi rallies now lay in complete ruins. Yet even as Berlin burned and Hitler's regime collapsed, another chapter of devastation was about to unfold thousands of miles away in the Pacific, where scientists had been working on something that would change warfare forever. The morning of August 6, 1945 started like any other in Hiroshima. People walked to work, children played in the streets, and vendors sold breakfast from small carts. Nobody knew they had roughly 3 hours left of normal life. At 8:15 a.m., everything changed forever. Enola Gay, an American B-29 bomber, dropped a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy over the city center. What happened next defied human understanding. The bomb exploded 1,900 feet above ground, creating a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun. The temperature at ground zero reached 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. People simply vanished, leaving only their shadows burned into concrete walls. The blast wave traveled at 984 feet per second, flattening everything within a mile radius. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled in seconds. Trees caught fire 3 miles away. Birds fell from the sky, their feathers singed off mid-flight. But here's the truly horrifying part. This was just the beginning. Within minutes, a massive mushroom cloud rose 60 feet into the air, visible from 400 miles away. Then came the radiation, an invisible killer that would claim lives for decades. People who seemed fine after the initial blast began dying within days. Their hair fell out, they vomited blood, and their skin developed mysterious burns. Around 70,000 people died instantly. Another 70,000 would die from radiation sickness and injuries over the following months. Entire families were wiped out. Hospitals collapsed with their patients and doctors still inside. The city's fire department was destroyed, so fires burned unchecked for days. 3 days later, before Japan could fully process what had happened, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Fat Man killed another 40,000 people immediately. The message was clear. America had more of these weapons, and wasn't afraid to use them. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, who survived Hiroshima, wrote in his diary, "Those who were able walked silently toward the suburbs in the distant hills, their spirits broken, their initiative gone. When asked whence they had come, they pointed to the city and said, 'That way,' and when asked where they were going, pointed away from the city and said, 'This way.'" The psychological impact hit Japan harder than any conventional bombing campaign ever could. How do you fight an enemy who can erase entire cities with a single plane? Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, just 9 days after Hiroshima. He specifically mentioned a new and most cruel bomb as a reason for ending the war. American leaders justified the bombings by claiming they prevented a costly invasion of Japan that might have killed millions more. Others argued Japan was already defeated, and the bombs were unnecessary. The debate continues today. The atomic age had begun with unprecedented destruction. 2 cities lay in radioactive ruins, their survivors facing cancers and birth defects that would plague generations. But something even more complex was about to unfold. The massive task of rebuilding a shattered world, and deciding what justice looked like after 6 years of unimaginable horror. The gates swung open, and Allied soldiers stepped into hell on earth. Nothing could have prepared these battle-hardened troops for what they found inside Nazi concentration camps. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms stared back with hollow eyes, bodies stacked like cordwood, the smell of death everywhere. At Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers found 60,000 prisoners still alive, barely. Another 13,000 corpses lay scattered around the camp. Some survivors weighed less than 70 pounds. They'd been eating grass and bark to stay alive. When soldiers offered food, many prisoners' stomachs couldn't handle it after years of starvation. American troops liberating Daisho were so horrified they shot several guards on the spot. Who could blame them? The evidence of systematic murder was overwhelming. Gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, ovens still warm with human ash. Medical experiment records documenting torture that defied belief, but liberation brought its own problems. Where do you put 10 million displaced people? Entire populations had been uprooted, shipped across continents separated from families. Displaced persons camps sprouted across Europe, housing survivors who had nowhere to go. Many had lost everyone they'd ever known. The search for missing relatives became desperate. Survivors posted names on bulletin boards, hoping for miracles. Children who couldn't remember their real names wandered through refugee centers. Some families were reunited after years apart. Others learned the worst, that they were truly alone in the world. Justice came slowly but surely. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, putting Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, the world said that following orders wasn't good enough. Personal responsibility mattered, even in war. Hermann Göring tried to present himself as a gentleman soldier. The evidence said otherwise. Rudolf Hess claimed amnesia when confronted with his crimes. Hans Frank, who'd terrorized Poland, suddenly found religion in his cell. These men who'd ordered the deaths of millions now begged for mercy they'd never shown others. The trials weren't perfect, but they established something crucial. The idea that certain acts are crimes against all humanity, not just war crimes, but crimes that shock the conscience of mankind. The testimonies of survivors became permanent record, ensuring the world would remember. Similar trials unfolded across the Pacific. Japanese war criminals faced justice for their brutal treatment of prisoners and civilians. Unit 731's medical experiments were exposed. The rape of Nanking was documented in horrifying detail. Some tried to claim they were protecting Asia from Western influence, a hard sell when the evidence showed systematic brutality. The reckoning wasn't just legal. Entire societies had to confront what they'd allowed to happen. How do you rebuild a country that participated in genocide? How do you restore trust when neighbors betrayed neighbors? But here's what's remarkable. People did rebuild. They found ways to forgive without forgetting. They created new institutions designed to prevent such horrors from happening again. The question was whether these efforts would be enough when the world inevitably faced its next great test of humanity. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, the world looked around and saw something almost impossible to comprehend. 50 million people were dead. That's roughly the entire population of South Korea today, just gone. Cities that had stood for centuries were nothing but rubble and memories. But here's what makes the aftermath even more staggering. The survivors had to figure out how to live again. In Berlin, people were literally digging tunnels through mountains of debris to get from one street to another. Some neighborhoods were so destroyed that former residents couldn't even find where their homes used to be. The weird part is that life had to continue somehow. Entire countries needed new borders drawn on maps. Poland shifted westward like someone had picked up the whole nation and moved it. Germany got carved up between the victorious powers like a pizza nobody wanted to finish. Millions of people woke up one day to discover they were suddenly citizens of completely different countries without ever moving an inch. Then there's the human cost that numbers can't really capture. Veterans came home with injuries that would never heal. Not just missing limbs or shrapnel wounds, but nightmares that lasted decades. Many couldn't talk about what they'd seen. Others couldn't stop talking about it. Some marriages survived the separation and trauma. Many didn't. Let's not forget the practical nightmare of rebuilding. Where do you even start when your entire city looks like the surface of the moon? In Japan, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced radiation sickness that would kill them years later. European cities had unexploded bombs buried under the rubble that still kill people today when construction crews accidentally hit them. The displaced persons camps became temporary cities housing millions who had nowhere else to go. Families spent months, sometimes years, searching for relatives. Red Cross bulletin boards were covered with desperate messages. Looking for my daughter Anna, last seen in Warsaw 1943. Most of those searches ended in heartbreak, but the political aftermath proved just as devastating in its own way. Before the victory celebrations even ended, former allies were already eyeing each other suspiciously. The Soviet Union and the United States had worked together to defeat Hitler, but now they faced each other across a divided Europe like prize-fighters in opposite corners. Churchill called it an iron curtain falling across the continent. Makes sense, right? The wartime alliance had been built on necessity, not friendship. Stalin wanted a buffer zone of communist countries to protect the Soviet Union. America and Britain wanted democratic allies and access to markets. These competing visions would define the next 50 years. War crimes trials attempted to deliver justice. But how do you really punish genocide? Some Nazi leaders were executed. Others got prison sentences, and far too many simply disappeared into new identities in South America. The legal precedents set at Nuremberg were important, but they couldn't bring back the dead or heal the trauma. What emerged from this chaos would reshape the entire global order, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict that would grip the world for generations. When the war finally ended, something remarkable happened. The world didn't just want to forget and move on. People everywhere demanded that this horror never happen again. But how do you make sure 50 million deaths actually mean something? The answer came in concrete and marble, in museums and monuments, in classrooms and courtrooms. Within months of Germany's surrender, survivors began sharing their stories. Not just the facts, the smell of fear, the sound of hope dying, the weight of loss that never really goes away. These weren't just tales of suffering, they were warnings. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel put it perfectly: to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Makes sense, right? If we don't remember, what was the point of their sacrifice? Then there's the fascinating psychology behind memory itself. Countries that suffered the most became the most determined to educate. Poland built over 400 memorials. Germany, the aggressor, created some of the most powerful Holocaust education programs in the world. The guilty teaching the innocent about guilt. Strange how that works. But here's where it gets interesting. Different countries remembered different things. Americans focused on Pearl Harbor and D-Day landings. Russians emphasized Stalingrad and the siege of Leningrad. Japanese textbooks barely mentioned Nanking or comfort women for decades. Memory, it turns out, is selective. Each nation crafted its own version of heroism and victimhood. The Nuremberg trials established something unprecedented: the idea that just following orders wasn't good enough anymore. Individual responsibility became law. War crimes became prosecutable across borders. The Geneva Conventions got stricter. International courts gained power. Well, at least on paper. Let's not forget the practical lessons either. The United Nations formed with 51 founding members, all swearing to prevent future conflicts. NATO created military alliances based on mutual defense. The European Union eventually emerged from the ashes, turning former enemies into economic partners. Smart move. It's harder to bomb your customers. Annual remembrance ceremonies became sacred rituals. Veterans Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Victory in Europe Day, every May 8th, every August 6th, every September 1st carries weight. Schools organize field trips to concentration camps. Students interview elderly survivors before they're gone forever. And the weird part is how these memories compete. Which tragedy deserves more attention? Whose suffering matters most? 6 million Jews versus 20 million. Soviets versus hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. The mathematics of memory gets uncomfortable quickly. Modern technology changed everything too. Videotaped testimonies preserve voices forever. Virtual reality lets people walk through Auschwitz. Social media spreads both education and Holocaust denial with equal efficiency. The battle for historical truth never really ends. Museums became temples of remembrance. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington attracts millions. Hiroshima's Peace Memorial draws tears from hardened visitors. Each artifact tells a story: a child's shoe, a faded photograph, a piece of barbed wire. But here's the ultimate question: did it work? Did all this remembering actually prevent future genocides? Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Myanmar, the list suggests otherwise. Human nature apparently needs constant reminding. The promise of never again remains humanity's greatest ongoing